Hello and welcome everyone to this very special edition of Healing Our Minds. Today we will be looking at psychoanalytical and Buddhist approaches to the idea of the mind. We have with us Dr. Oberoi Vahali, who is one of the few fully accredited psychoanalysts in India and professor at the School of Human Studies, Ambedkar University, Delhi. She trained as a clinical psychologist at NIMHANS and went on to earn a PhD from the University of Delhi, where her research explored the intimate ways in which Buddhism has functioned as a creative force to help Tibetans work through their trauma of displacement. Her attempts have been to link visions of psychotherapy with those of social and emotional justice. And for several years, she has been advocating for in-depth, low-cost psychotherapeutic and mental health services to be accessible to all in need of help, irrespective of their economic status. She will be in conversation with Mr. Rajiv Mehrotra, who has been a student of the Dalai Lama for many years and is also the honorary trustee and secretary of the Foundation for Universal Responsibility, which was established with the Nobel Peace Prize. His many books are available in more than 50 languages and editions. Today, the speakers will be exploring diverse approaches to healing our minds, drawing on theory and personal experience. We would really want this session and this conversation to be as interactive as possible. And so our request to you is to write in your questions to us by clicking on that little tab that you'll see at the bottom of your screens, which says Q&A. So as the conversation proceeds, whatever questions you may have, please do write into us with them, and we will try our best to pick up all of them towards the end of the conversation and address both the questions to both Mr. Mehrotra and Dr. Oberoi Vahali. With that, I'd like to hand over to Mr. Mehrotra and Dr. Oberoi Vahali.
Thank you, Aparna. I must say I feel deeply honored and blessed to be in conversation with Hani Oberoi. She has done such extensive hands-on work in helping people heal. I have merely struggled with myself and tried to heal my own mind. So I shall try and draw on my experience. And, I just wanted to flag a sort of a bridge from our last session with Dr. Sudhir Khandelwal, who's the former head of the Department of Psychiatry at All India Institute of Medical Sciences. As a psychiatrist, he primarily spoke about the pharmacological approach, which is what psychiatrists of his profession do. And I mean, and he was deeply candid and did acknowledge that in many cases, today what we are basically doing is sort of throwing chemicals at the brain and hoping for the best hit. And so in some ways, hit or miss is how a lot of progress is made in treating the mind. And I guess you can call it science and maybe not, with all its limitations. And so in the first sort of sessions of this series, we were really interested in looking at understanding from a more Western perspective and then bridging a gap with tradition, and which is why I think Hani is such an ideal voice to be heard because of her own work looking at evolving and access to the disadvantaged and the disenfranchised to psychoanalysis. And of course, the achievement of psychoanalysis, from originating from Freud, was that it was able to move mental illness from the asylum and the hospital to the office, and so that destigmatization, in a sense, happened. And it's a talk therapy, which meant that people who were otherwise functioning normally could also avail themselves of the treatment. And many people perhaps who was suffering from mood disorders were, benefit from talk therapy and other interpersonal forms of treatment, because there was a response that they were being cared for. And so I'd like to start with this, question to Hani, to bring this together for us, that the limitations of pharmacology, and before we come to, the Buddhist ideas and your own work with the Tibetan refugees, that for people who are struggling with their minds, what are really the options? We hear of psychologists, and I mean, such a range of within the paradigm of Western medicine, and how in the context of public health can psychoanalysis play out? How accessible is it to, for want of a better word, Aam Aadmi today? So, how does it work? What are the options, and how can we access it?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me here. And it feels, I feel a little nervous talking to Rajiv ji. He's such a tall figure in my head that, yeah. And thank you, Aparna, for moderating the session. And I am a great fan of Aparna's films too. So thank you very much for having me here. I did hear the last session with Dr. Sudhir, and I think he made some very interesting comments on mental health during the context of the COVID, especially, and the escalation of psychological problems and crises that people are going through. So pharmacological treatments have their own place, and I also see one of my former teachers from NIMHANS, Dr. Shekhar Shishadri here, with whom I first learned some art of psychotherapy, which has stayed with me also given his very creative personality. So I do think, and he himself is a psychiatrist, so pharmacological help is a significant part of the treatment when somebody is feeling out of control, or there are extreme situations in life, and one feels that one's mind is splintering. And at some level, there is no substitute to that at that time. However, what we need to see, like what Dr. Sudhir was also saying, that the crises that people go through are on a biopsychosocial spectrum, and it is very difficult to say that which contributes how much to the crisis that a human being goes through. But as a psychologist or as a psychotherapist, my take is generally to look at it from the angle of a human being's life experiences, the context from where a person is coming, and also the social historical situatedness of that particular life. And therefore it becomes very important for the problem not just to be wished away, or the problem not just to be done away with in some way, but to be engaged with. So there is meaning to engage with the crisis that a person is going through, because the life themes of a human being are often embedded in the symptoms that one is experiencing. So the symptom in that sense is not something which is only a problem, or it is not something which is an interruption. The symptom is also a condensed metaphor, or it is standing for so much of a human being's life. So, when we think about, we have been, I would not say that the efforts have been by myself, but I was fortunate to get a place in a university. And I was also fortunate to have a team of people who were eager to think about the questions of mental health from a deeper perspective, from an experientially closer perspective. And the struggle, therefore, was to not make it something which was like a quick fix solution, because I don't think there is any psychological way of working in which we can very quickly overcome things. We may get relief from whatever is plaguing us for a while, but the issues are often deeper in our own life as well as in the lives of people who come for therapy, or who come for counseling, or who come to talk about their life, simply speaking. And therefore, not wanting to get rid of issues is the first thing that I would like to say. Learning to coexist with difficulties is the perspective that psychoanalysis takes. And that is why at one level it is so misunderstood also, and it is so heavily critiqued as if it has, as if it takes too much of time. But such is the nature of life, such is the nature of human existence, that things remain, we do not come to face many truths of our existence until and unless they become critical at a moment of time. So what we tried to do was not psychoanalysis for the public. That would perhaps not be really very appropriate, and neither would it be possible. We tried to work with the derivative of psychoanalysis, the psychoanalytic psychotherapy approach, which means that life is to be engaged with, yeah, and the emotional crises in life are significant, and the issue is to expand the range of a human being's ability to tolerate their emotional difficulties, and also to remain, I would say, to remain in touch with certain things, but to also come to terms with the fact that a lot about our life, also our emotional life, remains unknowable. So to become comfortable with vulnerability, and at the same point of time to also become comfortable that neither is all of this going to get sorted out, nor is it that all of this is going to become very rationally available to our thought processes. And so to expand the range of being able to remain with unknowable things in existence. So what we tried to do was, so you could say that it is a form of deep care that one human being extends to another human being. But I must also say that the reverse is also true, that it is not just that the one who comes for help is only seeking help. The one who is coming to for help is also completing in many respects the personhood of the person who is extending that help. So it is a mutual process, and there I think is that each is gifting the other with something which is quite precious. To be taken into somebody's life is a precious gift that I receive from the person whom I may designate as a client or a patient. And all the terms are kind of, problematic in their own self, but I use the term patient with the cautionary note that patient is the one who suffers, who's suffering at that point of time. And therefore, to be able to extend oneself in that mutual journey of caring. Yeah. So that's one thing. And if I may add one small thought here, the point is, I think when we started with the Ehsas clinic, and before that we experimented for some time at the University of Delhi as well, the point was not just only to reach the economically marginalized, but to also experiment with the fact that when care is not commercialized very quickly into a fee and into a high fee model, how does it impact human subjectivity? When you receive care, I think many people who come to be cared for become far more freer in becoming carers of others. So it's like an ongoing chain,
Well, thank you. That's what you're really saying is that so much of the methodology of helping people and the approach and the technique it depends on the innate qualities of the caregiver. So it's that there isn't sort of a formula or a prescription that you can write to help someone heal their minds. And in my sort of very limited understanding, and I know that you have moved beyond the traditional paradigms of psychoanalysis. But some of those, challenges for psychoanalysis remain, no matter what approach you take, and that the sources of our feelings are often hidden from us, and what we say about them when we walk into a therapist's office or an office, or the space of a healer, cannot be what is really going on. And so what is really going on are things that we may be denying or repressing or sublimating or projecting onto others. And so the goal traditionally has been to bring these things to light. And so that, the logic was that once it comes to light, then, healing can begin, or the process of, the very act of defining it in some ways gives us something tangible and concrete. And the correlatives are that, a lot of work now is being done on what they call somatic healing, which look at the body and see how the body is a reservoir of emotions, our postures. So if we're feeling a certain way and depressed, we're like this, and we're feeling elated, our body is reflecting that. And just a minor tangent, because it's an area that we will be exploring later in the series, is yoga. And how the body is a repository of emotions. And so yoga is not just exercise, but is another mechanism of relieving this. And also that, and just going back to Freud, because I've been fascinated by him. I watched a television series. Is that the manner in which he moved from being a scientist to a kind of poet of the mind, so that it wasn't the tangible, concrete things that he later on articulated, but you use the word metaphor, and how we use metaphor to access that. I still remain concerned, but I think we'll move beyond that. Is that the model that you talk about, hugely desirable and desperately needed, but how we are able to locate it in the larger context of public health, particularly in the times of COVID, where so many people are looking for some ways of coming out of it. And I was really inspired that some of the things that you were flagging, that to coexist with what is unfolding in our lives. Because I think somewhere that the conditioning of the notion that of happiness that we have inherited, that we all need to be happy in some perfect manner, and that we're not able to cope with the imperfections that life throws at us. And I think the other very important fact that you flagged, and which is really at the root in some ways of Buddhist ideas, is when you spoke about the patient, for want of a better word, who comes in, and the sense of connectedness with the patient. And so that a very important part of healing is so the Dalai Lama will often talk about interdependence. The recognition that we are all in some ways interdependent, and in this together. And the other very interesting aspect that you came up with that was that the engaging with life. And I wonder if you could if you'd like to reflect a little bit on you only briefly mentioned it, but it is really coming into everyday vocabulary, this idea of resilience. That same group of people can go through the same kind of experience, and some have the resilience to, in a sense, roll with the punches, which is what perhaps resilience is, as opposed to standing up to it, brave and with great fortitude, but the ability to move with that. So give us a sense that while there is this emotional nurturing and connectedness, what are some of the techniques? One of the things that came up in the questionnaire that we had sent out is that people are feeling a great deal of uncertainty. So let's look at the idea of uncertainty. So what do you say to someone? And of course, each person's uncertainty is bred of his or her particular situation. But we're looking at a public health space here. And so we have to be looking at larger ideas that will plant seeds of reassurance. So how do you, from your vocabulary and approach, begin to address something like uncertainty and the feeling of insecurity that comes up?
So, I think one of the things that distinguishes the psychoanalytic approach from all other approaches, or I would say that what other approaches tend to take to different degrees from the psychoanalytic approach, is the training of the analyst, which is a very, very long, prolonged process of subjecting one's own life to a benevolent scrutiny with another analyst. So the first patient that every analyst has is one's own self. So one would go through these almost like 1,000-odd sessions across several years to look at one's life more deeply before one begins working with another person. And on the way, what one realizes is that the desire to control life, the desire to want to have, to be free of uncertainty and to be free of vulnerability. The paradox that life is always throwing is the opposite of that. And I think that is, as you said, that you are fond of Freud. I think one of his greatest contribution was that he decentered the human being, and he decentered the human being as a knowing subject. And he said that what will we control the rest of the world when we can't even control our own motivations or our own thoughts, our own desires? And much of this is completely out of the realm of our own knowledge base. So in the training of an analyst, this is a very, very crucial part to begin to submit to whatever is arising on the surface of consciousness. So the surface of consciousness becomes the space in which the past itself is also present. There is not a past apart from the present in that sense. So, in popular understanding, it is that psychoanalysts are working with some past material that they are trying to dig at or reveal, which gets revealed. But in actuality, psychoanalysts are always working like Buddhists on the surface of the consciousness. Whatever is emerging now at this moment is also replete with what is there in the past. So there is not a past apart from the present, in that sense of understanding experiential temporality. On the other side, when people are, so during the COVID, what we have seen is that people have, because people have had to stay within families in small spaces, the usual ways in which they were living has suddenly brought a very, the experiences that they have had here is that many issues which they could keep at bay in the past have begun to surface up right now. And also the question of, so the many things they didn't want to look at, and they had found ways of defending themselves with, and they were not wanting to go there. Now it is all on their face. And therefore people have, this, I would think, this is another kind of uncertainty. One is the uncertainty of the future, but one is the uncertainty with an encounter, which an encounter with your own past is bringing up for people. And there, I think that some access of mental health professionals who can just simply talk to people. This is not as if you have to do something very great. I think the art of listening itself is hugely therapeutic. When you listen to somebody with your full presence, and so you pick up from there something, what that uncertainty is bringing up for them is also embedded in their own life histories. And if you can help them to make emotional connections with it, that is where I think some of them feel very helped in 3 or 4 meetings also. It's not as if it has to be like, you have to go on with it for years altogether. And that begins to become the first insight into the self. That is what we have tried to do in the last year and a half. Just provide for listening circles, sometimes as groups that people can, and the group also has a life of its own that people can then begin to listen to each other and connect via identification, or also on one-to-one sessions, opening up of some themes. You see, actually, psychoanalytic work is a lot about, it's, if I were to give you a metaphor, it's like opening the windows in the room. So you go on opening new windows, and as you go on opening new windows, you begin to breathe more freely. And as you begin more freely, you experience more space in yourself, because the energy that you have spent in your life to keep things in a closet, that becomes available for you to now onwards live your life.
In Buddhism, we tend to see it in some ways a little differently. But before I sort of explore that, I'd really like to explore your own study with the Tibetan community in exile, which is really it's an amazing success story in so many ways, not just of their resilience in exile, but the fact that a community of about 150,000 people in exile in India for more than 50 years have managed to retain essentially their identity, their culture, their worldview, their state of being, while remaining welcome with their hosts. So, in a sense, that they are a work in progress about manifesting these elements of mental stability, mental health, and above all, resilience. So what were your, just briefly, it's you've done a very in-depth, just what were your observations as to what techniques and approaches, and some of the techniques are not conscious, it's just the way they are. It's the collective unconscious that is unfolding in exile, and they bring with them here. And then, of course, circumscribed by the leadership and the vision of His Holiness in terms of their education, etc. So what were your sort of key takeaways from the study?
So if I may first respond to the question of resilience more generally, and then I will come to the issue of resilience with the Tibetans. As a psychotherapist, I think we look for certain things in terms of resilience. Past experiences matter a lot. Yeah, familial upbringing is a major factor in how people would take future experiences in their life. From where whether trauma, everybody goes through certain traumas, and therefore trauma is such a subjective concept as well. I mean, what could be experienced as traumatic for you may not be for me, or what could be for me may not be for you. So, but how is trauma mitigated? That is a very important part in the development of resilience. So there are painful experiences in everybody's life, but at the same time, how was that painful experience held, recognized, denied, obliterated, erased? That would also go into the future capacities of how somebody is able to feel resilient or otherwise. Why the other thing very importantly from Freud that we get is his entire theory of what he calls as the deferred reaction or deferred action. And what he implies is that the first trauma somehow we are able to take care of. Yeah, we do many things. We make it invisible to our own self by repression or by projection or by any other thing, defense that we could be using. But it is often the second trauma which breaks a person. Yeah? When we re-experience trauma, or we re-experience patterns in our life, which we are also ultimately becoming contributors to, that is the time when people experience more of a sense of breakdown. So that is why it is not, there is another analyst called Winnicott who says that the fear of breakdown is not a fear of the breakdown in the future, but the breakdown has actually taken place somewhere in the past, but the person is anticipating it into the future, projecting it into the future. So resilience depends upon many aspects. It also depends upon the quality of the experiences that we have had and the quality of care or its absence that we have received. Also, of course, on, a lot on what are our larger cultural beliefs with resilience, what are the community's ways of handling it. So all of that would go into whether one is resilient, whether one breaks down, of course, the severity of what somebody has gone through. But as a psychotherapist, I would say this, that we begin with the idea that every patient is doing one's best. The mere fact that somebody is surviving and has kept one's life together is the best in spite of the symptoms that they are going through. So the therapist's faith is in the creativity of the patient who is coming there, and together we try to work with it. Now, coming to the Tibetan context, I think it has been a really, really deeply learning experience for me, and also something I would say is that how a community, in spite of collective trauma, has been able to hold it together for themselves. So it is their belief, it is their collective vision of life, their philosophy, and the translation of that philosophy into everyday psychology that they have acquired. And as you said, I think the role of the Dalai Lama is really unmatched in all of this, because he not only becomes, he hardly remains like an individual. He becomes like, he stands as a symbol for the entire community. And there are certain things that he does very particularly well thought of, and there are certain things that faith in him provides for the community at large. Yeah? And so I also would think that in the Tibetan context, the whole idea of trauma and to hold suffering as valuable, yeah, a worldview in which suffering is considered to be valuable and suffering is not thought about as something to be uncomfortable with or to become impatient with, has enabled the Tibetans to work so well. As far as the Dalai Lama is concerned, one of the things that I would like to mention is what he would do till about a decade back. And now I think because there's so much more to do, this practice is not taking place that frequently. But what was, a great practice was his meeting every torture survivor who comes in, and as a context in which he becomes the witnessing. So, when you're talking about resilience and when you're talking about trauma, I would also say that the role of the witness is a very important psychological role that the therapist tries to also provide for the person who is coming for therapy. In the Dalai Lama's context, when the torture survivors, Tibetan torture survivors under Chinese imprisonment would be coming, this would become a meeting of validating their past. And not only a meeting of validating their past, but he would also talk to them about the way in which this suffering was meaningful for them and from where a truer Tibetan identity could come up. And this was something that I never felt tired of being fascinated with, because I thought that, most ways of understanding psychology have not gone to that extent of something which was so powerfully painful for for an individual could become a moment of transformative capacity for them through the witnessing eyes of the Dalai Lama. So from somebody who's like a god that the elderly Tibetans worship to someone that the younger Tibetans can argue with at the political level, I think he represents many different things, and it would take a really long time to talk about it. But I do think that what is important in the Tibetan context is the non-denial of anger or forces of hatred, but also a cultural way of working through them and not giving into them. So that's a great resilience, again, I would think, as a collective that they bring up.
I think it's interesting that you just use the phrase non-denial, because I think that the essence of the Buddhist enterprise, in a way, and of course Buddhism, I mean, I should just sort of circumscribe this by saying that Buddhism likes to describe itself as a science, which says you don't have to be a Buddhist, you don't have to believe in Buddhism in order to accept or work with certain facets of it, which are available and accessible to all. And the Buddha famously said that when he was dying, that my word is not final, and it must be subject to reason, logic, and your own experience. And I think the premises of Buddhism are somewhat different to modern psychoanalytical approaches, in the sense that I think they work well. First, let me just stay with the idea of non-denial and suffering that you spoke about. And of course, the Four Noble Truths, which are the essential pillars of Buddhism, are about suffering. Is the fact of suffering, and the fact that there is a way out, and what the techniques are, and the outcomes of that. And so I think that the philosophical framework that emerges from Buddhism is to acknowledge, and suffering is not really the right word, because the Buddha used dukkha, and that was unsatisfactoriness. And I think there was a point to unsatisfactoriness, because to suffer is also it's also unsatisfactory. So suffering somehow semantically gives it a sort of very extreme manifestation of not being able to cope or to live with one's situation. So I think that the idea that that suffering is or dissatisfaction is caused because we do not see the true nature of reality. And once we begin to see it experientially, that this is in the very nature of reality, and the usual sort of the struggle that every aspirant has, that what you see intellectually, when does it become truly real for you? I mean, whether it is through a therapist or through philosophy, or it is making it real. So I think that non-denial, you don't deny the true nature of reality. It's the way it is, and then you begin to locate it in the larger space of the nature of reality, and some of the key elements of that nature of reality. We already briefly mentioned the idea of interdependence, is change, that nothing is permanent. I would just sort of, maybe in the context of the pandemic, flag that in a moment, that if you begin to reflect on impermanence across the spectrum and not necessarily engage with your particular predicament. So Buddhism is working with antidotes, in a sense, and there is a feeling, and hence this whole thing in mindfulness, that you live moment to moment. And there is a feeling in Buddhism that if you were to go back into the past, it might unravel and throw up things that in the present you are unable to manage. And so it is, and hence this, that layered with the idea of karma, and karma is impersonal, not judgmental, as the imprints of your motivations on your consciousness. So in a sense, your past is not the specific events that unfolded, but the imprints on your consciousness of what you were going through at that time, which then begin to play out. And what can we do to neutralize that beyond observing it and intellectually accepting it? So you have, the pillar of interdependence, you have the pillar of change, but most importantly, and that's sort of challenging for a struggling aspirant like me to explain, because it's non-conceptual, is the idea of what we call emptiness. And emptiness is obviously not the absence of substance, but really just to say that the I, that suffers. And I think that there has been a lot of research that shows that people who are suffering tend to focus excessively on themselves. And psychological testing suggests that when you interview these people, they're talking about I, me, my suffering, and I. And I think that when that sense of self can be softened by opening it up to embrace, through the idea of interdependence, other people too, then the focus on that I that is suffering is diluted. So you can't change the reality of your experience. You can sort of soften it, the self that suffers. You can antidote it in some ways by recognizing that it is incontrovertible reality. So I think that in the Buddhist community, and His Holiness frequently tells a story, and you mentioned this about the torture victims who come in. There was a doctor, senior citizen moment, but that was His Holiness's personal physician who spent decades in Chinese gulag. And when he was really seriously ill, he was released. And so His Holiness asked him that what was the most challenging moment of your captivity amongst Chinese? And he said, well, for a moment when my compassion for the Chinese broke down. And I mean, of course, we marvel at it as an idea, but there is a very sort of real counterpoint to it. That what we're really saying when we talk about compassion is that the more you think about other people, and that's what you were pointing to, I think, very eloquently, that the minute the therapist is more interested in healing the patient, immediately the equation changes. Unfortunately, in popular perception, the therapist is usually struggling with himself and is looking at how many billable hours he can chalk up. Now, if they were like you, I think the experience will be completely changed. And I think that, and hence what we also see in the case of the Dalai Lama and that, and the expression of who he is in the philosophy, is this aspect of compassion. That, and it's what you're talking about in some ways, that if you can feel this compassionate connect, the presence of the therapist, just the presence can have a powerful, healing effect. And I do want to sort of, before we turn to the questions, is that there is a great deal, I think that the role of Buddhism in therapy is sort of suddenly becoming very fashionable. And so, I read a lot of articles now on therapists who are bringing Buddhist ideas to it and basically looking at mindfulness, that, you become mindful of something. And we sort of, from a more traditional perspective, tend to look at that as being an aesthetic in a sense, that, you sort of become very calm and very peaceful. But the core issues that are troubling you don't really get resolved or addressed. It's sort of like a technique that sort of functions for a while like an anxiolytic. It doesn't solve anything, but it gives you a breather and a break. And so the imperative to sort of work through this in a different way to psychoanalysis, and I think each has its role. And His Holiness is always at pains to say that each one of us needs a different mental diet and different kinds of food. So we need different kinds of thought. But in this context that we meet today, with the shadow of a retreating COVID, I think it's important to sort of acknowledge and reassure ourselves and that change is possible, that healing is possible. And it's not that psychoanalysis is not for everyone, and nor is the Buddhist approach to everyone, for everyone. And that we have to look at the mental diet that works best for us. And our effort in this sharing of perspectives is to bring in the different religious traditions and techniques that people can use and to access. And looking at resilience from a Buddhist perspective, well, I think more universal. It's not uniquely Buddhist. Is that somehow when we say that the cause of suffering is our craving, and so, I mean, I hasten to add that I'm not able to practice any of what I'm saying, but I mean, I remain sensitive and aware of the ideas, and that we're just waiting for things to get back to normal. But we need to recognize that normal implies status quo, and things are always changing. It's never going to be normal in the sense that we have known it. And so by meditating, in a sense, and meditation is nothing but reflection on, so that it becomes a part of our familiar mental vocabulary on the inherent nature of change, maybe we will be able to embrace the new normal with greater energy and equanimity. And like I said, that to reassure ourselves that it is possible, it's challenging, it's difficult, but behavior change, character change is possible. And so there is hope, even as we sort of sit back and, try and normalize ambivalence and rebuild our new identities and the context we work in, and rework our the nature and context of our social relationships, all the things that nurture our lives and deal with the reality. And I'm afraid time is limited, so we will move on to questions, but I would love to have I have so much to learn and a much longer conversation with you, because I think that amongst the many challenges, and there just isn't space and time to engage with these, is beyond the personal narratives, is what you're looking at in your work is the whole collective narrative, is what is happening to us as a nation, what is happening to the fear that that is emerging from the larger unraveling of what we have been familiar with, in terms of whether it's the institutions, it's the discourse, and how we can do that. But if I may, sort of now request Aparna to throw open the floor to questions.
Certainly, certainly. A really interesting conversation here, and how interesting is clear from the wide range of questions that have been asked. They go in different directions. So I'm going to try and start off with questions that perhaps can keep the conversation a little more focused. So there's the first question that I'd like to put to you, Dr. Oberoi Vahali, is the idea of judgment. There is, because we hold on to the I so carefully, the idea of really opening our thoughts and our emotions to another person is often a very intimidating act. So how does a psychoanalyst, and this is a question from Seema Kakran, work around the fear that somebody else has of being judged? How do you create that sense of trust? And how do you sort of work through that? So if you could respond to that.
That is much of the process of psychoanalysis. When we say that the person who's coming for analysis will be able to free associate with one's thoughts and emotions, that is a concept. But to be able to free associate requires that one feels comfortable with the other and also with one's own self in that space. Yeah? So there are, and technique-wise, I would think that there are two things which are happening whenever we are opening ourselves up. It would happen to me, it would happen to anyone for that matter, is that the more we try to share, the more there are also opposite forces in ourselves which try to close us down. Yeah. So technically speaking, it is called as the forces of resistance, and the forces of resistance in the psyche are also because we feel we do not feel comfortable with the unfamiliar, and we also fear the judgment of the listener on ourselves. Yeah? So wherever we sense somebody is speaking and the person goes quiet, somebody is speaking and the person reverses the speech of what they were saying. So the stance of the therapist or the analyst moves from interpretation, or it moves from understanding to holding. Yeah. To holding that affect at that moment. Yeah. So it is not there. That's the time when meaning making is stopped, but being in the moment with the other person. Yeah. So if there is shame there, or if there is pain there, or if there is guilt there, that emotion has to be addressed. It's a little bit like you have a physical wound. You will not think at that time that, oh, I must go deep into the wound. You need to dress that wound. So in the therapeutic moment, it is taking care for what is coming in the way of expression. And when you are able to sense somebody's feeling, yeah, of shame, of pain, of guilt, of inhibition, that is what frees the path for the person to speak further. So it is a process, it is not by my saying that I will not judge you, that the other person will not feel judged. It is for being cared in a certain qualitative manner that the other begins to feel more comfortable in opening up. And this may take a long time. Yeah? So to wait for that, but waiting is not a passive waiting. Waiting is a co-journeying with the other there.
I should add that this notion, the idea of judgment, is equally challenging when applied to oneself. The manner in which we judge ourselves. And so a very important learning in this process of, we want to say behavior change or character change, is kindness to oneself. And we have to draw the distinction between self-love, which is narcissistic, but mind you, there is an underlying element of narcissism also in people who suffer extremely, because there is an exaggerated sense of the I. So this softening of the self, is equally applicable to looking at oneself. And I think that looking at oneself with kindness gives one the confidence and the courage to be oneself, including in the engagement with a therapist. Because the great challenge for a therapist often, as for any sort of spiritual healer or teacher, and this is what Freud was really trying to have people do sometimes almost inadvertently on the couch, is to reveal themselves to themselves. Because we are also tempted to be in performance mode, even with the therapist. And that's why I have so much of love and regard for Honey, because both as at the human level and in action, she's able to create, just listening to her, she's able to create that space of trust where we can be vulnerable. And that is as much art as technique.
Indeed.
And if I may add one thing to what Rajiv ji said, when we can have loving kindness for the self, that's the time when therapy should be closed. In one way, that is the goal of therapy, that the internal judgmental voices that we are carrying, which we will also color the therapist with, which is technically again called transference, where our past will be lived out onto the person of the therapist. And this may be an internal theater of huge punitive judging kind of voices. And so when we reach loving kindness, that is the end of therapy. I think that's a good place we have reached.
Right. But, the central question of when is it that you need to approach a therapist, when is it that, maybe talking to a friend is enough? So there's a question that has come, when does speaking to a friend suffice if you're not diagnosed with, a sort of label, but you still feel extremely conflicted? Is that a good enough time to sort of reach out to a therapist? I mean, what would you suggest?
Comes to a therapist if they could wish that away. Yeah, people only come when they are in a state of crisis. So, or when the family perceives that there is something which is going out of hand. Apart from the candidates who want to train, who come with a certain desire to come, all other people come when they feel that there is a crisis which feels unhandleable by teachers, by friends, by relatives. When the other sources are not really, and they are all very, very important sources. If we were to believe that the work of psychological care is only the prerogative of the therapist, I think we would be doomed as a society. It is the work of our friends, it is the work of our people older, younger to us, it is of family, it is of teachers, and that is how society has sustained itself. But when a crisis becomes insurmountable, either the person comes saying that the world is so mean to me, and it takes a long while before one will say that, well, I have also factored into the creation of what I'm going through, or people will come in a state of breakdown. So
the Buddhist sort of correlative of that is the Sangha, and hence a great emphasis on the Sangha, the Buddha Dharma and the Sangha, the community. And it is, and I think that what has happened in modern society with its fragmentation, that the community has gotten fragmented. So what the Buddha implied by the Sangha was that people who were on similar journeys and communities, so there was an empathetic understanding of what the others were going through, not merely in spiritual practice, but in everyday life and living. Now we live in such diverse communities that it's often very difficult to find people who will have, an empathetic understanding or similar experiences, so that they could really just experientially be there, for you. But I completely am with Dr. Oberoi, as I am with most things.
So, which would sort of bring us to the next question, which has been asked by Sering Yangdol, where he's talking about his work as a mental health service provider in low-resourced, exiled communities. I mean, and specifically the Tibetan community. His question is, how can they encourage people to seek help and connect to them during their difficult times? Because he notices a lack of willingness or hesitancy in seeking help. So how can they overcome this barrier? And your own work with Ehsas, I'm sure, sort of has many such sort of examples and experiences that you can share with us.
On the more general note of people who are on the peripheries of the socioeconomic strata, I think what works best with them is on-demand sessions. Yeah, we have to break the framework of a weekly session, or we have to break the framework of, whatever is the setting that we have in our mind. We need to accommodate their life. I recall a laborer who was coming to us, a construction worker who was coming to us at Ambedkar University for therapy, and he would want to come once a month. He had to travel from Meerut, and the time that he would come was 1 day's labor loss for him. So when he came, we would try to break the rule of the 1 hour session or the 50-minute session, but as he needed time, that needed to be provided for him. And only when something was emergent in its nature would he return back. But what I think also happens here is that people can develop a sense of faith that they can return to this place if something is critical in their life. And I think that is also a resource to be kept in mind. And so if we are hell-bent on a setting and the way that we have to work, I think we will miss out a lot of people on the edges of society. As far as the Tibetan community is concerned, I would just think of myself as a student of the community, and from where I have gained a lot in terms of being human in my life. One of the things that I felt was that there was a hesitancy sometimes to speak about felt states of breakdown, because the cultural vocabulary was not accommodating that. Yeah, that everybody, that the larger discourse, the unstated one, but there was a discourse in the society that we will be able to handle all of this. And sometimes people were not being able to handle that. And I would think that culturally embedded ways of introducing the space, where what Rajiv ji was saying, and maybe he would like to respond to it more fully. But as a therapist, sometimes, we have to give the place for somebody who feels like a victim. That person has to feel like a victim for a while before that person will be ready to give up the victim position. Yeah, so we would not dismiss that part. In fact, that part would be brought more fully in, even if it is distorted, and you can see the distortions, but that also has to be cared for, because one has been feeling like a victim but has remained stuck in it. Now one has to speak about that victim part to be able to go beyond it in life, or to give it a place in their life. So I think in the Tibetan context, I feel that uh, many Tibetans have been quite interested, in fact, to integrate modern discourses in psychotherapy with cultural ways of thinking about emotional distress.
I think the challenge that the Tibetan community, I think Hani quite rightly, pointed out, the cultural aspect and the hesitancy to seek help. And I think there are two very important elements to it. One is that the Tibetan approaches, techniques, practices, the cultural space, its evolution really happened in a completely different space in the isolation of Tibet. And even Tibetan Buddhism itself and its practices and techniques, which are now available to us all, evolved in those spaces where the very cohesive Sangha in very small communities provided that nurturing space. And that sort of 50, 60 years down the line, this the victimhood for a large number of Tibetans, as the external environment of support is now diluting, because it's there are other pressing issues on the global horizon, and the politicization of support for the Tibetans, which is not really support for the Tibetans, but for the agendas of the United States government or India or whoever is doing this. It makes it that much more difficult for them to climb out of that space. And I mean, finally, it is, as I think Hanya so eloquently said, it really has to do with the empathy and connect of the therapist, and ideally for the Tibetan community to develop their own psychoanalysts and people who have trained from within the community who can build these bridges. Because it's all very well to say go to your Lama or go to XYZ, but I think that the honest Lamas themselves, I mean, His Holiness has said to me, in fact, that look, I mean, I am a monk. I cannot relate completely to the predicaments of a householder or someone in your position, and hence, it turns out that the very nature of the Buddhist enterprise is that it encourages that individualization in a sense, and it's not, even the master is tested to scrutiny and practice and whether it's working. So I think that we should be looking at more Tibetan therapists, being trained, who are able to bridge this gap.
One of the sort of charges, when it comes to the idea of mental health, therapy, or anything like that, is that this is something that is the privilege of the entitled or the elite. That those who are without resources seem to be more resilient, and they seem to not really face the kind of troubles that the more privileged set of society seems to face. How far do you think this is correct?
Well, I think that in the sense that, the whole idea of resilience and our shared experience is that the more comfort that we have, the easier things have become. Our generation, many generations, have not been through partition, have not been through wars, have not been through suffering and deprivation of the next meal and livelihood issues, or domestic violence, or or what have you. So in terms of our own mind training and processing, for want of a better way of describing it, increasing suffering, it's an incremental increase in suffering. So I think that's what really happened when COVID came. COVID just came with a big bang. And so we just, we were just completely thrown off key, and we didn't have the terms of reference. And this issue of uncertainty that comes up, there was so much uncertainty, because our inability to embrace rapid change, as I briefly mentioned, but it was also that the external environment was constantly sending us conflicting information. So our sense of the reality of COVID. So we're looking at people dying of oxygen. We know people who died of oxygen, and yet state, which is supposed to be the sort of the big brother in more ways than literally, was telling us, no, it didn't happen. And so this distortion, this in a sense organized distortion of reality. And one day I'd love to sort of have a conversation with Hani as to how we begin to address this much larger canvas than just our immediate personal traumas. Because never before in human history has the world been so interdependent, and we've had to experience and are exposed to this much larger canvas of uncertainty. I mean, if I was a young child and someone said to me, oh, in 50 years the temperature is going to rise, by 3 degrees, and the oceans are going to come and sort of flood half the planet, I'd be scared as hell. Or at least subliminally at the back of my mind, this would be happening. Or whether it's hate speech, and whether it's the majority community that fears the rapid growth of the minority, true or not true, who cares? So I think there are all these layers that are happening. And so finally, people who have had an incremental exposure to suffering and have far greater skills of an ability in general to resilience. And I have to say that it was very interesting that the Sudhir who spoke last week, and he had done 2 years study on the India-Nepalese border, living in a village community for 8 or 9 months, that the degree of mental disorders was very high and distinct from mental illness. So which means that people who had dysfunctional illnesses, which, whether it's schizophrenia or bipolar, or things that we normally believe, some of us believe, I don't, but that it is what they call an endogenous thing, that it just happens, without specific identifiable causes. So on that scale, there was a very large, almost similar levels of prevalence compared to our kinds of everyday dissatisfactions, with the boss or increment or the kind of car we've had, and we can be extremely traumatized by things like that too.
If I may
I'm not sure that,
Aparna,
yes, please, Doctor.
Two things were striking me as I was listening to Rajiv ji. One, that when we say this, that psychotherapy and psychological difficulties are the privilege of the elite. Yeah, I think somewhere the psyche speaks. Its ways of speaking are different. So what we often find that people who have a lot of socio-economic and historical marginalization, in their case, you may find, and this particular lingo of speaking about emotions is not part of their upbringing as such or their culture. The body speaks. Yeah, the body speaks, and it speaks through what Rajiv ji was also saying, a session on somatic experiencing and somatic work. So the body is many a times um, the place where emotional pain is located. So somebody may be having a backache, somebody may be having, a neck pain that doesn't go. So we see this across the class spectrum as well. Yeah. So then we have to together find the metaphors through which this can be translated into something which is manageable, which is workable and understandable by both of the people who are involved. And the other thing I was just thinking, listening to Rajiv ji, was that the larger political realities and how they impact the psyche. And again, Arthur Kleinman is an American, medical anthropologist who did a lot of work in the Chinese context. And he found that when the individual, the place of the individual or a person as a unit was not available, again, somatic symptoms were greatly on the ascendance. When you could not say that I'm not happy with the political system, the body became the space in which this pain was being expressed. And as a teacher at a university, I must say this, that before the pandemic in some sense was not an isolated event, especially in a metropolitan city like Delhi. Students were highly stressed out prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic in that sense became a repository of many other things that they were grappling with, because suddenly they found under the new system that they were feeling very alienated from parents. Yeah. So when the parents were taking a majoritarian position, the young people did not know how to go back to that same home, how to talk about it. So there was stress about it. There was a feeling of, where do I belong? What is my identity? I don't fit here. I don't fit. Those were the most affected ones, psychologically speaking, who could neither speak to the parents about their differing views, nor fully believe in them, because that implied a loss of home and family. And especially if we will recall the violence on the Muslims in February 2020, and the pandemic just coming a month later to that. So I think a lot of things are, unprocessed things are lying in the psychological trauma of the pandemic, and also silencing of voice all around. So this is something I also saw in the Tibetan context, especially with people who were coming in the 1990s and early 2000, who were called as the recent arrivals and crossing the border and coming over to India. A certain degree of paranoia was as if protective for them. Yeah. And in India today, I find that a certain degree where you can't speak clearly your mind because you don't know where your speech is going to go to, that becomes like a new normal in which people begin to exist. And that is hugely stressful, anxiety provoking at the psychic level too. So, the matters of the psyche in that sense, I would like to say, are not just coming from something like a natural, the biological phenomenon, like a pandemic which is affecting us at the biological level, is layered with political realities which are impacting the psyche in a certain way.
On that note, how is one to really deal with negative emotions? And that's a question for, again, both of you, because I think both psychoanalysis and Buddhism have a very interesting approach to the idea of negative emotions. So, Dr. Oberoi Vahali, would you like to go first, and then Mr. Mehrotra?
Maybe Rajiv ji would like to go first.
We don't consider, we don't have, we call them afflictive emotions rather than negative emotions. So, and what are afflictive emotions? Afflictive emotions are emotions that intrude ultimately and act as filters to our experiencing the true nature of reality. So, we keep emphasizing this aspect that if you can truly see and experience the true nature of reality, then you are free of the suffering of suffering. I mean, and so we will all suffer in some ways, whether it's, sickness, old age, death, the loss of those we love, and enlightenment, whatever it may be, or happiness, whatever it may be. And I'm not referring to what the American Constitution implies, doesn't mean that we stop feeling pain or sadness at what happened to other people, including ourselves. It just means that we see it for what it is, and a part of reality. And so so obviously, afflictive emotions are obstacles in those, and amongst the most sort of the significant afflictive emotions have to relate to attachment and attachment. So again, the way it works and what meditation, I noticed there was a little question in the box on mindfulness and overblown, overrated in our belief. So it really is that we look at antidotes. So what is the antidote to attachment? So is that if I am deeply attached to someone, so a practice, and Buddhism gives us specific practices to tackle specific afflictive emotions. So I will just use attachment as an example, is to really look that I think someone is very beautiful, and so I'm attached. Now, is that person inherently beautiful? We sort of use a logical reasoning. If the person was, or a beautiful painting, then everybody would think so. So we have a sort of a structured thought process that reminds us, or if somebody we're deeply attached to, that person is also aging and changing. And so what is the facet of that person that we're attached to? Is it constant? Is it enduring? And so on and so forth. So there is a reasoned logical process that we go through. It's called analytical meditation, that we go through. And if we keep repeating it, the mind is in a sense retrained to see people in a sort of with equanimity and with universality. So no one is in particularly more attractive or less attractive than the other person. So it works on this principle. So, and I think that the great challenge, that whether it's psychoanalysis or Buddhist or any approach, I mean, from any philosophical or other tradition, is that we have become so used to instant solutions. So we want one session with the therapist, or we want one session with a Buddhist meditation practice to take away, solve this problem of negative emotions. And here again, kindness to oneself. That just because His Holiness famously at one point was asked that what is your biggest challenge as a monk, and he said, when I see a beautiful woman. So it doesn't have to do with the occurrence of the thought, but as to how that thought is processed and your relationship with the thought. So we pop pills, because we can't deal with the reality of thought. And part of mindfulness practice doesn't turn out that way. And mindfulness, that's another topic for the next. I have to just share with you. The next week we have let me make a pitch for next fortnight session. We have a very remarkable monk, Venerable Geshe Tashi Sering, who's the chief abbot of the largest monastery in exile, and he spent 24 years in the United Kingdom teaching, and so he's very eloquent in English, and will answer some of these questions in far greater detail than I can. But it is that it's also kindness to oneself, to be able to see a thought for just a thought, and a thought is not necessarily reality. So part of the training of the mind is to be able to see that. And there are many techniques that help us see a thought as a thought and not as reality.
If I can add here, taking from the last thing that Rajiv ji is saying, you see, thoughts feel like they have tremendous power when people come for therapy. So a murder in the head feels like as if one has already done it. Yeah, such is the power of the thought per se. So the work is often of being able to very much at some level, I would say, similar with the idea that there is no negative emotion per se. And the other thing that psychoanalysis believes is that the best and the worst are always very lying in very close proximity. So the task of the analytic work is to help us see what is trapped in the destructive tendencies or our destructive acting out in life, even if it is like, addictions, or even if it is ways in which we are destroying our own bodies. But close to that will be something, or even obsessive symptoms for that matter, yeah? um, and other predicaments that a person is going through. So to be able to work with the psyche in such a manner that the destructive part gets taken care of, and therefore the potential can be released. That's one. The second thing that in analytic work, as it is done, is that what is really when somebody is very angry, and it is listened to as anger, in the therapeutic hour, it is often listened to as pain, as distress, yeah, as anguish. So that shifts, in some sense, that one was raving, one was shouting all through one's life. But when it can be seen for what it is, or what is hate, actually speaking, hate is thwarted love, yeah, that when when our seeking for love is repeatedly rejected, it may convert itself into its antithesis in that sense of hatred. So the working with emotions, which is again, and what takes place in psychoanalytic work, is that not to know this once, it will not go away. They're only transient moments of insight. They come and go, they come and go. And so it is constantly like, you make yourself available. And how this is worked through is that the analyst does not react. Yeah, when the hatred is put onto the analyst, or when the anger is, the patient is aggressive towards the analyst surprises the patient by being able to take this, and the feeling therefore that my anger is not as destructive as I imagined it to be, that others will not go away because I'm angry. And that also increases a person's capacity for one's own emotions. And then what Rajiv ji is saying, the work of analysis is often of making a very punitive and punishing superego into an internal benevolent voice. That this voice can become like a guiding voice for me, and not something which is reprimanding me all the time. So a lot of people are plagued by these internalizations, where they are victimizing others, but at the same time also victimizing themselves, feeling like a victim, and yet also having a victimizer sitting inside of themselves. And through that, then working towards more benevolence for the self. And through that, I mean, it also has its effect in terms of the relationships in one's life.
On a lighter note, that I was once shooting a film with His Holiness, and in a Q&A session, somebody asked a question, and he said, I can't give up smoking, and so that's really bothering me, and it's really intruding on my ability to practice the dharma, because I'm just obsessed with smoking. And so he said, well, keep smoking. Because it's the old story of from Ramakrishna and in our legends of the guy who was keeping track of who was going to the prostitutes. And so it's similar that sometimes we can so obsess with our negative emotions being negative that they just keep reinforcing. And so if we were to look at our emotions with a quality of lightness, it would be far easier I think, to deal with them, to get rid of them.
Indeed. Unfortunately, so much tougher to practice in one's everyday life.
Life is easy.
Absolutely. There's something really beautiful about what you said, Dr. Vahali, which was that, hate is really thwarted love. I mean, this is just turning out to be such an interesting session. I think we could have gone on for quite some time, but I see that, we're already 25 minutes above, our end time. So I'd like to bring this, very insightful evening to an end with one last question, which I think is something that, again, both Buddhism and psychoanalysis sort of spend a lot of time on, and help whoever sort of is going through the process make better sense of, which is the idea of the I. Me, who am I, and how do I deal with everything around me. So if both of you could give us a sense of how you deal with the I, perhaps in your own lives, because this is theory and personal experience that we're trying to bring into this session. So how do the two of you deal with the notion of the I, and what can we learn from that, therefore?
Since I fail so terribly and I need some advice and help, I will hand this first over to Honey, and then give you my little hypothesis.
I think I'll spend my life in trying to find an answer to that question for myself. But basically, what I learned from psychoanalysis about this is that having a preoccupation with the small I, is not bad. It is much needed in life, and therefore to be a witness and to see oneself sometimes rising, but many a times falling in life, and then again rising a little bit and then again falling, is a process to it. And what I have often taken from Buddhism is the larger perspective on the I, that I am an interdependent being, and I am, if I were to think of myself as myself, actually, I would be nothing, and on the other side, the fullness of everything. So, and from psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, that this is a long, long journey, and to be patient with the self, to be patient with the problems of the self, and to not, to not believe this, that I can never be rid of my own smallness, but my smallness also has a value in the sense of, this is, I mean, it's a very ordinary part of being human. I think that we struggle, and we again see meanness in ourselves, and we again see, um, anger rising, we again see judgment coming up, and yet to be grateful for the fact that we can continue working with all of this. But I think what psychoanalysis needs to really take from Buddhism is the larger vision of the self as empty of itself and yet full of everything in the universe. And perhaps very humbly, if I may say, what Buddhism can take from psychoanalysis is the patience of working with things with which we are stuck in life, so stuck with sometimes desire, stuck with sexuality. And as we see in the clinic, people hardly use sexuality for pleasure. It is standing for so many other emptinesses of their life. Promiscuity is being played out not because they're deriving pleasure from it, but because, actually speaking, it is speaking to their it is doing something to their loneliness, it is doing something to their so I think that is quite remarkable about psychoanalysis, the patience to work with you know things which don't move, and where that, okay, I cleared this in the last session, but the next session my patient will again come with self-doubt, or will again come back with some projections onto me, all of that. And I think Buddhism is really, really par excellent when you think about that shunyata is actually fullness, So,
thank you very much, Hani. That was so eloquent, and I agree with sort of every word you've said. And I'm just wondering, which I is it that agrees, with you, even as that it struggles with its own definition, in sense of, I think the great challenge is to let go of trying to conceptualize and understand the I, because that very process tends to reinforce it. And why is that, that seeking in the first place? And it really is because, as I said earlier, that, when I suffer, and if I can pause long enough, or distance myself enough during that period of suffering, to try and look at the I and see it in sort of entirely relative terms, and not as an absolute I. And when I look for that I really can't find it. And it's not always that I'm able to find the equanimity or the safe space to be able to do that. And it's a wonderful exercise. I mean, when this is over, if you could just sit back and try and reflect on where is the I don't think you will find it. It is constantly discovered in relative, terms, and as we try and go through the neti approach, if you're not this, not this, not this, you'll find you can't find it. And why can't you find it? And you can't find it really because it's a designation. It doesn't have an independent existence. And the problem is that, we so deeply experience it and see it and act on the basis that it is somehow independent. And does it exist? Well, I would argue it exists as an imputation in order to enable us to function. This is what Hani was saying. And again, I just go back, that when the Buddha attained enlightenment, we have no idea as to what happened to him. And he stepped out and he waited for days and he didn't know what to say. And so we have all, we sort of hypothesized he saw the true nature of reality, he experienced, a lot of verbal gymnastics. So I think the first effort that I try and do is to, not hold on to any particular sense of the I. And so that really is my sort of failing journey.
Right. So I think first we need to go through psychoanalysis to find the I, and then we need to go through Buddhism to forget the I. On that note, let me thank everybody who has been here and who has joined us and participated in this extremely invigorating conversation. Our email address for all of you to write into is FURHHDL.org. That's Foundation for Universal Responsibility of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. So FURHHDL.org, Healing Our Minds. We will be back in a fortnight. And we would like to request all of you to write into us with your questions, with your suggestions, your critique, anything at all. We'd love to hear from you. The idea behind these sessions really is to respond to the needs of the community. Our aspiration is to, keep coming back to you with something that's useful. So keep writing to us and keep attending. We will be back on the 18th of February, same time, next Friday. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Oberoi Vahali and Mr. Rajiv Mehrotra for, taking us through this very, very interesting conversation on the I, the absence of it, and many other such ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Hani. I learned so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.